All right, welcome. Today, we're jumping right into a question that has, puzzled thinkers for literally centuries. How can a finite human being possibly know an infinite God?
I mean, logically, this is where you'd start, right? You try to weigh the evidence, figure out if it's even in the realm of possibility. The question itself kind of sets the whole thing up as this big intellectual puzzle we've got to solve.
But what if that whole starting point is just completely wrong? The theological argument we're going to unpack today says that by asking if, we've already missed the entire point. It suggests we need to just reframe the problem from the very beginning.
Okay, so let's dive in. Here's the path we're going to follow to get our heads around this. First, we'll see why that initial question is basically a dead end. Then, we'll redefine what knowledge even is, seeing it as an event. We'll explore how it reaches us through a veil, get a feel for its emotional texture, uncover its pretty surprising source, and finally, see why this kind of knowing demands action.
So let's kick off with this really provocative idea. This line of thinking doesn't start by asking if God can be known. Nope. It starts with the absolute conviction that God is known, and then it digs into how that knowledge actually happens.
Now, what's so fascinating about this is just how bold it is. From this viewpoint, knowing God isn't some theory you have to prove, it's an accepted reality. It's the unquestioned starting premise. It's the starting line, not the finish line.
And why is it considered so solid? Well, because according to this view, the knowledge isn't measured against outside evidence. It's only judged by its own source, which is God's self-revelation, His Word. And what that means is that questions from the outside, they just can't touch it. It's a self-contained reality, confirmed only from within.
Okay, so if knowing God is a given, what kind of knowledge are we even talking about? Well, this argument says it's not like knowing a fact from a textbook or a formula. It's something you actually participate in. It's a dynamic event.
And that brings us to this really key definition of faith. In this system, faith isn't just believing a list of doctrines. Faith is the event. It's the actual moment of encounter and response where a person engages God's revelation with their entire being.
So here's the crucial takeaway. Knowing God and having faith aren't two separate things. They're exactly the same thing. You can't have one without the other. To know God is to be participating in that active, responsive event we call faith. Okay, so if this knowledge is an event, how does it actually get to us? And the answer here is super clear. It is never a direct, unfiltered glimpse of God. It always comes to us through signs, through a kind of veil.
And this quote just nails the idea perfectly. The point isn't to try and rip away the veil to see God in His raw, naked essence, which, by the way, would be totally disastrous. Instead, the real goal is to properly understand the signs and the works that He uses to make Himself known.
This slide lays out the process so well. Look, you have God's reality, which is totally inaccessible on its own. That reality is then mediated or filtered through His works and His Word in the world. And that whole process finds its clearest, most decisive expression in the person of Jesus Christ. And our response to all that? That's what we're calling faith. That's the knowledge.
The text gives us this fantastic analogy for this. Moses on the mountain, remember? He asks to see God's glory, but he's told, "No one can see my face and live." So instead, he's hidden in a rock and only gets to see God's back after he's passed by. It's a perfect picture of knowing God through His actions, through His effects, not through some direct vision of who He is.
So we've seen how this knowledge happens, but what does it actually feel like? Well, it's described using these powerful, almost paradoxical pairs of words that give it this really unique character and texture.
First up, you've got love and fear. The argument is that knowing God means you've been given this incredible, undeserved permission to love Him above everything else. But, and here's the twist, precisely because that permission is such an overwhelming gift, the only proper response is this profound sense of awe, or what the text calls fear. The love actually creates the fear.
And the second pair is clarity and mystery. The revelation of God is described as being absolutely clear, no doubt about it, no ambiguity. And yet, the very clarity of that revelation, the fact that it's God revealing Himself, at the same time confirms that He is this vast, uncontrollable mystery. It's like the more clearly you know Him, the more you realize just how much of a mystery He truly is.
And now we get to what might be the most mind-bending part of this whole thing. If our knowledge isn't something we generate ourselves, then where in the world does it come from?
Well, this framework introduces an idea it calls primary knowledge. And this isn't our knowledge of God, it's God's own perfect knowledge of Himself. It's the dynamic, internal life of the Trinity,
the Father, Son, and Spirit knowing each other perfectly, eternally. This primary knowledge exists entirely inside God long before we ever show up. And here it is, the core idea. Our tiny, finite knowledge of God is only possible because it's a gracious echo of that primary, divine self-knowledge. Think of it like a reflection. We don't generate the image in the mirror, do we? We're simply allowed to see a reflection of the knowledge God already has of himself. Our knowing isn't something we produce, it's a gift we receive.
So where does all this lead? Well, it brings us to a final, really practical, and honestly challenging conclusion. What happens when you know God in this way? The answer is simple. It is never, ever a passive experience. This slide just sums it all up perfectly. Since God always takes the first step, our knowledge is always a response. And since faith involves our entire being, that response can't just be a mental "I agree." No, this total, active response has a name: obedience. It's about following, not just watching.
And this is the bottom line. According to this way of thinking, there's no neutral ground. You can't stand on the sidelines and just observe God like some interesting subject. This knowledge isn't just about what you think, it's about what you do. It demands a decision.
So we end here, if this theological framework is right, that this very specific kind of knowledge is an active, responsive, obedient participation. It kind of pushes us to ask a much bigger question. Is any true knowledge ever really just a neutral act of observation? What does it actually mean to truly know another person, or a piece of art, or even ourselves? Now that's a question we're thinking about.